17 years ago, I started a little folder on my desktop called Curious Cues. And in this folder, I would save and collect any odd, interesting, unique, fascinating, amazing body language cue, verbal cue, thing that I noted about a person. And they were all over the place. For example, I clipped a little cue that I saw when Lance Armstrong was talking to Oprah and Larry King, and it later turned out he was lying. I clipped a little section of one of Britney Spears' interviews in 2006 on Dateline. I clipped some interesting conversation starters that I noticed important people were using that were changing the nature of their conversations. I did this for the last 17 years, and then I started to notice patterns. I started to notice that very highly charismatic people were using very similar cues, not just with their body language and their voice and their face, but also their words. And I also noticed that some of the bad guys, some of the people who rubbed us wrong, who turned out to be lying later, I would watch an interview with an athlete who said, "I've never doped." And then 2 years later would come out and saying, "I dope. Yeah, I dope." And I would notice that there were cues that they leaked of guilt or shame or anger or contempt that had rubbed me wrong originally. And I realized there was also a pattern of cues that we don't like seeing in people we're with, that turn people off, that take away or sap our charisma. And so in 2019, I started to think about, could I turn them into a book? Could I begin to create a system for reading and decoding cues of others, but also for encoding and sending the right cues ourselves? And 2 years later, Cues is here. So in this video, I want to talk about, first I want to reveal what Cues is all about. I want to reveal the table of contents. Everyone's been asking, what's in there? What's in Cues? Today I'm going to talk about it. I'm also going to talk about some of the hidden research that I did behind the scenes for Cues. This is 17 years in the making. Cues, very basically, just so we are all on the same page, cues are the powerful verbal, nonverbal, and vocal signals humans send to each other. What we don't realize is that we are sending thousands of these cues to each other every day, yet they go missed. And I think those are all filled with opportunities. My goal is to give you a framework for you to be in control of the cues you send, to be able to read the cues that are being sent to you, and that makes you more purposeful, more impactful, and more charismatic. So let's talk about what the actual book is about. So I break the book down into a couple different parts, a couple different types of cues. There are 4 cue buckets. Nonverbal, so our body language, the cues we send with our face, our hands, our posture. Next is vocal. Yes, there's so many hidden cues in our voice, how confident we sound, how trustworthy we sound. Then verbal, so the cues we send and the words we use in our email, text, chats, in person, Slacks, all the different hidden cues that are in your verbal content or in others' verbal content. And then lastly, imagery. So color psychology, the images that we use and how that affects people's perception of us. So that's how we break down the book. And I try to have real examples in each section. So in every chapter, the way that I like to think about writing is I always have a really powerful piece of science and then a case study with a real person and then an action step. So for example, right in the introduction, I talk about how some of these cues happen on Shark Tank, and I break down a little cue that Mark Cuban shows in a pitch. On Shark Tank, we did some analysis. We wanted to know what's the difference between successful pitches and unsuccessful pitches. So we discovered that oftentimes sharks will give away their hesitations with their nonverbal cues. So right in the intro of the book, I talk about Mark Cuban's secret cue, which is called a mouth shrug. So a mouth shrug is really interesting because it's an upside down U of your mouth. So your mouth actually goes into an upside down U. Oftentimes, we also pull our eyebrows up and sometimes even close our eyes. This is a very, very typical cue that you'll see when someone doesn't believe something. It's a cue of disbelief. So a mouth shrug is literally upverting your mouth so that you cannot speak out of it. So when someone goes, they're disbelieving, in doubt, trying to not say something. So that's an example of one of the cues that we break down from real life. There's also all kinds of interesting people in the book. In chapter 1, I talk about the charisma formula. So what makes someone charismatic, how we can break that down. I also analyze some really cool people like my favorite, Oprah. So I talk about Oprah. I also talk about Jeff Bezos. We break down what makes some of these people charismatic. So there, I believe in chapter 1. Chapter 2, I dive into some of the nonverbal science. So for this one, I had a lot of fun. I was thinking about what kind of example can we use where cues are hiding in plain sight. So for this chapter, I used hidden cues in The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. There are cues everywhere. We just don't realize what they're saying. So I actually break down some of the cues that are hiding in The Last Supper. A little sneak peek is I would take a look at the hand gestures. Why is one hand up and why is one hand down? I would take a look at who is taking up space versus who is not taking up space. You also can look at the Last Supper in terms of proxemic zones. I teach about the hidden cues in our space in this chapter. So in the hidden space zone, who is in the intimate space, who is in personal space, who is in social space, and who is beyond. And so you can actually break down the Last Supper even in terms of zones. So that's a really fun one in this chapter. The next chapters, I break down all the nonverbal cues of charisma, warmth, and power. So in the charisma chapter, I talk about specifically what are the cues that very highly charismatic people use when they're communicating, even looking in their profile pictures, in their videos, in their online communication, as well as their offline communication. I talk about the cues of trust and warmth and likability. What do likable people do? What do warm and trustworthy people do to build a sense of connection and camaraderie? And then I also have an entire section on nonverbal cues of competence, power, and capability. What makes impressive people impressive? Why is it that some people can walk into a room and you immediately want to know them? One of the examples I give in this one is of the presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy. This is a really practical way to think about cues. And so I break down the debate, and I'll show you this actually for a second. Let's see if you can see some of the cues that are lurking even in this one little screenshot. So if you look at this one little screenshot, this is just still taken from the video. What hidden cues are here? So I break down, here's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. So I break down all those cues in the book so you can see that even in a little snapshot of this debate, there are all kinds of cues that these candidates were sending, and they change the nature of the election. So I won't give too much away. That was a really practical example of how certain powerful people show their power while others don't. Another kind of fun thing is in this section, I also talk to you about cues that are hidden in our eye gaze and our content. We go through the reading the minds and the eyes test, which is can you tell someone's emotions by reading their eye cues? So that's a really fun one. And I point out some of the secret cues that are happening on people's faces so you can be better at decoding and spotting hidden emotions. Then in the verbal section, I talk about how to sound more confident, and I talk about warmth and trust cues with your voice, as well as power cues with your voice. How do you get people to stop and listen? How do you get people to take you seriously? It might be with hidden cues in your vocal power. We make it as practical as even analyzing your voicemail. I talk about how to leave a great voicemail. I talk about how to sound more likable. I talk about how to sound more powerful. We use some great examples. I found an incredible example from Margaret Thatcher. Former Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher, used to make vocal notes to herself in the margins of her speeches. And I break down the actual notes that she wrote to herself when she was delivering speeches. They are fascinating. After our vocal section, we talk about the verbal cues. I break down what are the hidden cues in your emails, in your profiles, in your resumes. I give you really concrete examples, and I also give you some swipe files, some scripts that you can use, that you can immediately put into your emails to make them more powerful or more trustworthy based on what you're going for, and how you can do a little email audit. So in this section, I walk you through how you can audit your own emails to see how you're coming across to others. If you specifically are doing a lot of email or a lot of verbal presenting, this section is incredibly important because it will help you get faster responses to your email. It will help people want to reply to you more quickly and more thoroughly. So the kind of verbal cues that you use in that section are incredibly important for how you come across. And lastly, the fun section is all about our imagery, why we wear certain colors. You know, there is a reason why Cues is red and Captivate was blue. I talk about that. Well, I wear more red now because those have different psychological meanings for different people, as well as the imagery that we have in our profile pictures and our marketing materials, and how we come across to others, and the subtle signals that we send in how we come across on our brand assets. That's my whole table of contents reveal. There's so much juicy stuff in the book. Really, my goal is for you to be more in control of your cues. The more in control your cues are, the better your communication, the more deeply you can connect with people. And I think the more meaning we have in our relationships. So I hope you'll check out the book Cues wherever books are sold. I also narrate the Audible version if you want to hear my vocal power while I do the different voices in the book. I would love it. And I want to thank you so much for supporting my work, supporting this channel. I want to thank you if you're considering a buy. This work means so much to me. This book is 17 years in the making, and I'm so honored and excited to bring it to you. Thanks. Don't forget to check out all of these goodies.